I was petrified about it, by the way. And, we got through it. And I think it was during that time period when I started to think about things.
Famous. And looking back, he says that fear was the start of everything, the moment he began questioning the life he'd built. Simon Cowell, the man behind the most savage judging panels on television, the voice that could end a singer's dream with 3 words or turn an unknown into an overnight sensation. He built an entire kingdom on confidence, on sharp opinions, on never blinking first. And then one hospital visit knocked it all down. His son was given a diagnosis, the kind every parent dreads hearing. And in that instant, the shows, the contracts, the cameras, none of it mattered anymore. He stepped back from the spotlight almost overnight, no explanation given, leaving the industry and his fans guessing. What actually happened? Stick around, because the real story behind Simon Cowell's quiet exit is more emotional than anyone expected. What sparked the shift? For decades, Simon Cowell was a fixture of the entertainment industry. His face appeared on screens across the globe every single week. People tuned in just to hear what blunt, often brutal verdict he'd deliver next. That reputation for honesty or harshness, depending who you ask, turned him into one of television's most recognizable personalities. Pop Idol, American Idol, The X Factor, Britain's Got Talent. Wherever there was a stage and a panel of judges, Simon was usually sitting in the middle of it. Beyond the judging chair, his company, Sicko, was busy discovering and shaping the careers of artists who'd go on to dominate the charts. Television and music were not just his career, they were his identity. Naturally, that kind of life demanded everything. Late nights, packed schedules, contracts being signed on planes between cities. There was barely room for anything else. Then 2013 arrived, and his world started tilting in a different direction. That year, Simon entered a relationship with Lauren Silverman, a woman whose husband, Andrew Silverman, happened to be someone Simon considered a friend. When Andrew filed for divorce, he cited adultery, and Simon's name ended up in the legal paperwork. It didn't take long for tabloids to grab hold of the story, and within days it was everywhere. The plot thickened further when news broke that Lauren was pregnant, and the child was Simon's. What could have turned into a messy, drawn-out legal battle never actually reached a courtroom. By August of that year, the Silvermans had reached a private settlement, which meant Simon was spared from public court dates or formal involvement in the proceedings. Not long after, he publicly acknowledged that he was going to be a father. Then came February 14th, 2014. His son was born. That single day reshaped everything for Simon, not simply because a baby had arrived, but because it forced him to confront his own life in a way nothing else ever had. Here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. Simon had spent years insisting on camera and off that fatherhood wasn't for him. He believed his habits were too fixed, his freedom too valuable, his work too consuming to make room for a child. But something cracked the moment he saw the ultrasound image of his unborn son. He couldn't quite explain it, but he knew, right then, that the version of himself who swore off family life was already gone. A different Simon was waking up, one who now found himself thinking about birthdays, school runs, and bedtime far more than ratings or record deals. When it came time to choose a name, the decision carried weight. They named him Eric Philip Cowell, a deliberate nod to Simon's own late father. It wasn't just a name. It was a thread tying past to future, an old memory folded into a brand new beginning. And from that point on, Simon made a quiet promise to himself. Eric wouldn't be raised like a typical celebrity kid. No entourage dropping him off at school. No handouts dressed up as love. Simon wanted his son to understand the value of working for what he had. The same lesson, in some ways, that had shaped Simon himself. As Eric grew older, the shift in Simon became impossible to ignore. He started declining major projects, the kind that once would have been irresistible simply because they'd keep him away from home too long. Deals that used to come first now came second. The man once obsessed with viewership numbers and signing the next big act began showing up for the small things instead. Bedtime stories, school plays, simply being present. That's where this story truly begins. 5:16 p.m. Eric started kindergarten that year, and that's when everything Simon had quietly suspected finally had a name. Whenever Eric ran into something difficult, Simon was right there beside him, not hovering but ready. He didn't sit back and observe from a distance. He stepped in, smoothing the rough edges before they could turn into real struggles for his son. He kept working, sure, but his entire schedule now bent around Eric's needs rather than the other way around. The sharp-tongued TV personal. ID the World News started fading into the background, replaced by a quieter, gentler man that almost nobody got to see. Chasing the next big deal stopped being the priority. Being home, being present, that's what occupied his thoughts now. Fatherhood had cracked open feelings he assumed were buried for good. After losing both of his parents, Simon hadn't expected to feel that kind of love again. But Eric brought it rushing back. Every single day held some small new discovery, and these tiny moments with his son started outweighing everything else in his life. What Simon didn't fully grasp yet, though, was that Eric's path was going to look different from other children's. Noticing the signs. As Eric grew, Simon began clocking small details that felt slightly out of place. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed problem. But these little observations lodged themselves in his mind and refused to leave. He found himself watching his son more closely in certain situations, and while nothing seemed outright alarming, something still felt different. It wasn't anxiety driving him. It was something quieter, something that nudged him to rethink his own day-to-day approach to fatherhood. He didn't bring it up much with people around him, but internally, something was shifting. As Eric moved past the toddler stage and into early childhood, that quiet concern deepened. Simon had always kept a close eye on his son, but now that attentiveness sharpened into something more intense. Every interaction with Eric started to feel like it carried more meaning. This wasn't ordinary parental worry. It came from a place of real, deep connection. He kept noticing patterns that didn't quite line up with what he'd seen in other kids. Eric tended to stay in his own world, quiet and self-contained. As his son's second birthday approached, Simon realized Eric still hadn't said his first words. Other toddlers his age were already stringing together little sentences, but Eric remained largely silent. Simon tried telling himself it was just a timing thing. Kids develop differently, he'd say to himself. But the worry wouldn't fully go away no matter how many times he pushed it aside. Something in him kept insisting that this wasn't simply a late bloomer situation. And here's something that even people close to Simon didn't fully understand at the time. The signs weren't isolated to speech. Out in public, Eric would often seem completely overwhelmed. Loud environments, bright flashing lights, crowds of unfamiliar faces. He'd clamp his hands over his ears or turn away entirely. At first, Simon chalked it up to ordinary sensory overload, the kind any small child might feel in a chaotic world. But it kept happening. Again and again, in places that should have felt familiar and safe. Friends and family tried to reassure him. Every child develops on their own timeline, they said. Some take longer to talk, to walk, to feel comfortable around others. And while Simon appreciated the reassurance, he couldn't shake a deeper instinct, the sense that his son was experiencing the world in a fundamentally different way. Simon had spent his entire career reading people, catching the tiny details others overlooked, identifying what made someone unique. With Eric, that same instinct was firing, but he couldn't yet put it into words. Sleep became elusive. Simon would lie awake running scenarios through his head, wondering if he was doing enough, wondering what Eric's future might look like. So he started digging books, articles, late-night research sessions on child development. But answers didn't come easily. The more he learned, the more new questions surfaced. There was no single moment of clarity, just a slow unfolding of understanding that demanded patience he didn't know he had. What became clear, though, was that Eric was remarkably sharp. He picked up on things instantly, solved problems without needing guidance, noticed details that flew past most people. He understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. He just expressed it differently. Not through words, but through actions, glances, small gestures that revealed just how switched on he really was. Simon slowly came to realize Eric wasn't behind. He was simply walking a different road, on his own terms. The concern Simon felt was never about disappointment. It was rooted entirely in love. He wanted to give Eric every tool, every resource, every bit of support he might need. Conventional milestones stopped mattering as much as the small victories now did. A moment of real eye contact, a gesture that signaled progress, a sound that meant something. Still, somewhere underneath it all, Simon understood this was only the start of a much longer journey, and he braced himself for whatever came next. The quiet strength of a father's love. While Simon wrestled privately with mounting concerns about Eric, almost no one on the outside had any clue what was unfolding behind closed doors. To the public, he was still the same fearless judge, famous for blunt critiques and unshakable opinions. But behind that image, something fundamental had shifted. The man who once measured his days in deals and ratings had begun stepping back from that world entirely, pulled towards something that mattered far more to him now. Eric did make a handful of rare public appearances. One moment in particular stood out on Britain's Got Talent, when he reached over and hit the golden buzzer during a performance. The audience erupted, viewers at home melted, and for a brief second, the world saw a softer, more tender version of Simon Cowell. But what nobody realized was just how much preparation had gone into making that single moment possible. That appearance wasn't spontaneous. It was meticulously planned. Every detail had been considered in advance to make sure Eric felt calm and secure. Simon had learned, through trial and error, exactly how to shape an environment around his son's needs, stripping away anything too loud, too bright, too overwhelming, and surrounding him only with familiar, trusted faces. None of it happened by accident. It was the result of months of quiet observation, learning, and adjustment. When the press picked up the story, the narrative became simple. Fatherhood had softened Simon Cowell. What they didn't understand was how much deeper that transformation actually ran. Because this wasn't a man becoming a little gentler. This was a man rebuilding his entire life around someone who experienced the world in a completely different way. 5:18 p.m. He turned down opportunities that would have kept him away from home for stretches at a time, restructuring his entire professional life around Eric instead. At first, people assumed it was just typical new dad behavior, something he'd eventually grow out of. They figured he'd snap back to his old self soon enough. But this wasn't a passing phase. This was a complete reordering of how Simon moved through the world. Online chatter started picking up. Fans began noticing small details about Eric, how he responded differently in certain settings, how Simon seemed unusually protective during public moments. But Simon refused to engage with any of it. He didn't entertain the speculation or feed the rumor mill. Instead, he kept his focus locked on the one thing that actually mattered: his son's well-being. Eric wasn't following the typical developmental script, and Simon had made peace with that. His son had his own rhythm, his own way of navigating the world, and that became Simon's new normal. Behind closed doors, though, Simon was relentless. He consulted specialists, scheduled appointment after appointment, kept asking questions that didn't always have clear answers. He buried himself in research and leaned on professionals who actually understood childhood development. Every consultation brought something new, sometimes hope, sometimes more uncertainty, but Simon never let up. He wasn't just chasing a diagnosis. He wanted to understand fully how to show up for Eric in the right way. Somewhere along this journey, Simon's entire worldview started to shift. Here was a man who'd spent his career evaluating talent, deciding who had what it took to make it, and who didn't, a man who'd built an empire on standards and perfectionism. And now, his own son was teaching him something entirely different. Some of the most meaningful moments happened far from cameras, far from anyone watching, quiet routines, safe spaces where Eric could simply be himself. Those moments meant more to Simon than any award or headline ever had. Meanwhile, the tabloids kept speculating and the noise kept growing louder. But Simon held his ground, waiting for the right moment to speak, one that wouldn't compromise Eric's privacy. Until then, his entire focus stayed on one goal: making sure his son felt seen, heard, and supported in a world that rarely slows down for anyone. What happened next would change everything. The diagnosis that reshaped their world. Everything came to a head during a family vacation when Eric was just 4 years old. Simon had planned what he believed would be the perfect getaway, quality time, a break from the grind, a chance to simply be present with his son. But almost as soon as they arrived, things began unraveling. Eric struggled at every turn. Simon initially chalked it up to normal adjustment difficulties, but it quickly became impossible to ignore. The resort itself, loud, busy, overstimulating, proved too much for him. New environments unsettled him. Unfamiliar food went untouched. A disrupted sleep schedule threw him off completely. Every small deviation from routine, every unexpected sound or sight triggered reactions that left Simon at a loss for what to do. It all came to a head one evening. The terrace was packed with families, laughter, conversation, music drifting over clinking plates. Eric froze, his hands shot up to cover his ears. He began rocking in his seat back and forth, completely overwhelmed. The noise kept building and nothing Simon tried seemed to reach him. He simply shut down. Simon sat there beside him, helpless, trying to understand what was happening to his son. That night he called Lauren. Both of them knew, without saying it out loud, that they couldn't keep waiting. This wasn't about fear. It was about finally getting Eric the support he needed and learning how to parent him properly. Months went by. Specialists observed Eric carefully, ran assessments, asked Simon and Lauren detailed question after detailed question. Then, one morning in December 2018, Simon walked into a small office to receive the results. He'd been bracing for this moment, and yet nothing could have made it feel light. The diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder. The words themselves weren't a total shock, but hearing them spoken aloud made everything suddenly, undeniably real. It wasn't a theory anymore, it was fact. Simon started to understand his son in a new light. Eric's mind simply worked differently, not worse, just differently, with its own unique way of processing and solving problems. He'd faced certain challenges that required careful, deliberate support, the kind most people would never even notice was happening. One of the specialists walked Simon through the specifics: difficulty with speech, strong reactions to certain sounds, a deep need for consistent routine to feel secure. It all lined up. Simon sat quietly, absorbing every word. But the report wasn't only about challenges. It also highlighted real strengths. Eric picked up on patterns almost instantly. He noticed details that escaped most people entirely. He could lock onto a single subject with remarkable focus, and his memory for sequences was genuinely impressive. Doctors classified his condition as moderate, meaning he'd need substantial support in certain areas while also having real strengths worth nurturing. The goal was never to fix Eric. It was to reshape the world around him so he could thrive on his own terms. Here's the part most people never knew. The diagnosis itself wasn't actually the hardest part for Simon. The hardest part was figuring out how to tell the world, or whether to tell it at all. Simon had spent decades living under a microscope, but Eric had never asked for that kind of exposure. His privacy came first, always. Still, Simon wanted people to eventually understand what made his son so remarkable. That same evening, Simon sat down on the floor next to Eric, who was meticulously lining up his toy cars, each one placed with exact precision. His concentration was total, unwavering. And watching him in that moment, something clicked for Simon. Eric wasn't missing anything. He wasn't broken in any sense of the word. He was simply different, and that difference carried its own kind of beauty, one that didn't need correcting. The diagnosis also reframed Simon's own past instincts. He thought back to all the work trips he'd turned down, the loud events he'd quietly avoided, the moments he'd been labeled overprotective. At the time, he couldn't have explained why he was doing it. Now, it all made sense. His instincts had been shaping their life around Eric's needs long before anyone had a name for those needs. From there, the path forward became clearer. Eric needed speech therapy to help him communicate. He needed occupational therapy to support his motor development. He needed behavioral support to navigate the challenges of daily life. And Simon had to step into a completely unfamiliar role, researching constantly, asking endless questions, staying current on new approaches and techniques. He let go of old habits and built new systems, ones designed entirely around Eric's world. Life as Simon knew it had fundamentally changed. Every decision from that point forward ran through one filter: what's best for Eric? After the diagnosis, Simon Cowell's entire life pivoted. The things that once consumed him, fame, travel, television, business deals, quietly stepped aside. His days now revolved entirely around his son. The spontaneity he used to thrive on disappeared, replaced by structure, consistency, and careful planning. Eric needed predictability. He needed each day to unfold the same dependable way. So Simon set out to build a world where his son could feel safe and grounded. Back home in Malibu, Simon didn't waste a moment. He brought in professionals to redesign the house from the ground up, softening harsh lighting, dampening loud noises, adjusting textures throughout. Every room suddenly had intention behind it. Nothing was left to chance. From furniture placement to ambient sound, every detail was chosen with Eric in mind. The house transformed into a genuine sanctuary, a place where Eric could simply exist without pressure or overstimulation. Simon's entire schedule reorganized itself around Eric's routine. Mornings began with simple, grounding tasks before moving into therapy, some days speech therapy, other days occupational therapy. Even something as ordinary as a playdate required meticulous planning behind the scenes, even though it looked effortless from the outside. 5:18 p.m. Simon would mentally rehearse every possible scenario in advance, just to make sure Eric never felt overwhelmed. Their bond deepened not through conversation, but through sheer effort, patience, and time invested. Alongside that, Simon found himself wrestling with emotions he never anticipated. He wasn't grieving who Eric was. He was grieving the future he'd once pictured, the spontaneous road trips, the easy banter, the inside jokes fathers and sons typically share. Those particular moments weren't part of his reality with Eric. Instead, Simon learned to read an entirely different language, one made of movement, glances, and small physical cues rather than words. Slowly, piece by piece, He began to understand what those signals meant. Therapy sessions came with their own emotional weight. Simon watched his son struggle to form sounds that should have come effortlessly. During occupational therapy, he saw Eric work through exercises designed to help him manage touch, sound, and movement. None of it was easy, but every small win, a new word, a longer hug, a flicker of eye contact felt monumental.